The phone call came through to Julian Cross's office at 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon in November 2025, routed by his assistant with an apologetic note that it seemed urgent and was from his son's school. Julian was in the middle of reviewing quarterly earnings reports for Crosstech Industries, the renewable energy company he had founded in his garage 15 years ago, and that was now valued at $18 billion, making him one of the wealthiest black men in California and one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the clean energy sector. He picked up the phone expecting a routine call about a parent-teacher conference or a request for volunteers at the school auction, and instead heard the voice of Dr. Richard Pemberton, the principal of Westwood Preparatory Academy, speaking in the clipped, formal tones that people used when delivering bad news they wanted to distance themselves from. "Mr. Cross, I'm calling to inform you that we've made the decision to expel your son, Marcus, effective immediately. We'll need you to come to the school to collect his belongings and to discuss the details of the expulsion with the disciplinary committee." Julian felt the words land like physical blows, each one requiring a moment to process. Expulsion. Effective immediately. He set down the pen he had been holding and tried to keep his voice steady. "I'm sorry." "What? Dr. Pemberton? What are you talking about? What happened?" "There was an incident yesterday involving Marcus and another student," Dr. Pemberton said, and Julian could hear papers rustling in the background, the sound of someone reading from a prepared statement. "Marcus was involved in a physical altercation that resulted in injuries to the other student. Given the severity of the incident and the school's zero-tolerance policy on violence, the disciplinary committee met this morning and determined that expulsion was the appropriate consequence." Julian's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Marcus, 17 years old, a junior at Westwood Prep, had never been in trouble before, had never been violent, had always been thoughtful and careful and aware of how he carried himself as a black boy in a predominantly white institution. The idea that Marcus had been in a fight, had hurt someone, seemed impossible. "Dr. Pemberton, I need more information. What exactly happened? Who was the other student? What did Marcus say about it?" "We can discuss the details when you come in," Dr. Pemberton said, and his tone was dismissive, final, the tone of someone who had made up his mind and was not interested in debate. "But I want to be clear that this decision is final. Marcus is expelled, and he will not be allowed back on campus. We'll need you here within the next 2 hours to collect his things." Julian felt the anger rising hot and sharp. "I'll be there in an hour. And Dr. Pemberton, I want Marcus in the meeting. I want to hear his side of the story before I accept anything as final." There was a pause on the line, and Julian could sense the hesitation, the discomfort. "Marcus has already been sent home. We thought it best that he not be on campus during the transition." "Sent home?" Julian repeated, the anger sharpening into something colder. "You expelled my son and sent him home without calling me first, without giving me a chance to talk to anyone or understand what happened?" "Mr. Cross, we followed our procedures. The disciplinary committee met, made a decision, and we're now informing parents. This is how we handle these matters." Julian wanted to argue, wanted to demand that they reverse the decision, wanted to shout into the phone that they were making a mistake, but he also knew that losing his temper would only make things worse, would give them ammunition to paint him as the angry black father, unreasonable, defensive. So he took a breath and said, voice tight but controlled, "I'll be there in an hour. Have the committee available to meet with me." He hung up before Dr. Pemberton could respond, sat at his desk for a moment processing the shock and the anger, and then called his son's cell phone. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice small and shaky. "Dad?" "Marcus, what happened? The principal just called and said you were expelled. Tell me what's going on." "Avreem." There was a long silence on the line, and Julian could hear his son breathing, could sense the weight of whatever Marcus was carrying. "Dad, I didn't do what they're saying. There was a fight, but I didn't start it. I was defending myself, But they didn't believe me. They didn't even really ask. They just decided I was the one who was violent, and they expelled me. Julian felt his chest tighten, felt the familiar cold knowledge settling over him, that his son, his black son, had been judged and sentenced before the facts were even clear, that the assumption had been made that he was the aggressor, the threat, the one who needed to be removed. "I'm coming to the school now," Julian said. "We're going to sort this out. Just stay home, stay calm, and we'll talk when I get back." They hung up, and Julian sat in his office for another moment, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of this moment, the pivot point where his role as a father and his role as a wealthy, powerful man collided with the reality that wealth and power did not protect black children from assumptions about their bodies, their behavior, their worth. He thought about the money he had given to Westwood Prep over the years, the donations that had funded new science labs and scholarship programs, and the capital campaign for the Performing Arts Center. He had given quietly, through a foundation, not wanting to draw attention or to have his generosity create expectations or obligations. But he had given a lot, millions of dollars over the past decade, because he believed in education, because he wanted to support the school his son attended, because he thought it mattered. And now the school had expelled his son without due process, without a fair hearing, without apparently considering that there might be more to the story than what they had decided was true. Julian stood, grabbed his jacket and his car keys, and walked out of his office, telling his assistant to clear his afternoon, that there was a family emergency. He drove from his office in Santa Monica to Westwood Prep in Brentwood, the 20-minute drive giving him time to think, to strategize, to consider what he would say and how he would approach the meeting. If you are reading this and thinking about the ways that assumptions about black children shape discipline and consequences, about how schools claim to be fair and objective but apply rules unevenly, about the gap between institutions' stated values and their actual practices, then you understand why Julian Cross drove through Los Angeles traffic feeling a mixture of fury and fear. This is a story about what happens when a father uses his resources and his voice to fight for his son, about the institutions that protect themselves at the expense of the children they claim to serve, and about the cost of demanding accountability from places that are more interested in reputation than justice. Westwood Preparatory Academy sat on 15 acres in the hills above Brentwood, a campus of Spanish-style buildings with red tile roofs and manicured lawns, and a view of the Pacific Ocean on clear days. The school had been founded in 1947, catered to the children of Los Angeles' elite, and had an endowment of over $200 million, built on generations of wealthy families who sent their children and grandchildren and made the school a cornerstone of their philanthropic portfolios. Tuition was $62,000 a year, and the waiting list was years long, and the school prided itself on its academic rigor and its college placement rates and its commitment to developing ethical leaders. Julian had chosen Westwood for Marcus because it was the best, because he wanted his son to have access to the same opportunities as the children of Hollywood executives and tech founders and real estate magnates. He had been aware, choosing the school, that Marcus would be one of a small number of black students, that he would stand out, that he would face challenges that white students did not. But Julian had believed that the school's stated commitment to diversity and inclusion meant something, that the environment would be one where Marcus could thrive, where he would be challenged but supported, where his blackness would not be a liability. Now, driving through the gates and parking in the visitor lot, Julian wondered if he had been naive, if he had put too much faith in an institution that ultimately saw black students as risks to be managed rather than individuals to be educated and nurtured. He walked into the main administration building, gave his name to the receptionist, and was directed to a conference room on the second floor. Dr. Pemberton was waiting along with two other people. A white woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Mrs. Linda Cartwright, the Dean of Students, and a white man in his 40s who introduced herself as Mr. Thomas Hayes, the head of the disciplinary committee. They all shook hands with the kind of strained politeness that preceded difficult conversations, and Julian took a seat across from them at the polished wood table. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Cross," Dr. Pemberton began, and Julian noted the formality, the distance, the way they were already treating him as an adversary rather than as a partner in his son's education. "As I mentioned on the phone, Marcus was involved in a physical altercation yesterday with another student, a senior named Chase Langford. The altercation took place in the hallway between classes, and it resulted in Chase sustaining a broken nose and bruising. We have multiple witnesses who saw Marcus strike Chase, and given our zero-tolerance policy on violence, the disciplinary committee determined that expulsion was the appropriate consequence." Julian listened, his hands folded on the table, and when Dr. Pemberton finished, he said, voice calm but firm, "I'd like to hear the full story. What led to the altercation? What did Marcus say happened? What did the witnesses actually see?" Mrs. Cartwright spoke up, consulting a folder in front of her. "According to the witnesses, Marcus and Chase were in the hallway, and there was a verbal exchange, and then Marcus punched Chase in the face. Chase fell and hit his head on a locker. The witnesses were consistent in their accounts that Marcus initiated the physical violence." "And what did Marcus say?" Julian asked. Mr. Hayes shifted in his seat. "Marcus claimed that Chase provoked him, that there was a history of tension between them, but he acknowledged that he threw the first punch. Given that admission, and given the injuries to Chase, we felt the expulsion was warranted." Julian felt the anger tighten in his chest. "So you're telling me that you expelled my son based on witness statements and his admission that he punched someone, but you didn't investigate what led to the punch? You didn't ask what the provocation was, what this history of tension involved?" Dr. Pemberton's expression became more guarded. "Mr. Cross, we understand that there may have been context, but our policy is clear. Physical violence is not tolerated, regardless of provocation. We have to maintain a safe environment for all students, and that means enforcing consequences for violent behavior." "And what consequences did Chase face?" Julian asked. "If there was provocation, if there was a history of tension, presumably Chase played a role in that. What happened to him?" There was a pause, and the three administrators exchanged glances. Then Mrs. Cartwright said, "Chase is not being disciplined. He was the victim in this incident." Julian stared at her, the pieces clicking into place, the pattern becoming clear. "Let me make sure I understand. My black son gets into a fight with a white student, and despite there being provocation and a history of tension, my son is expelled and the white student faces no consequences because he's the victim. Is that correct?" Dr. Pemberton's face flushed. "Mr. Cross, this has nothing to do with race. This is about the actions that were taken and the injuries that resulted. Marcus threw a punch, Chase did not. That's the basis of our decision." "Is it?" Julian said, and his voice was cold now, the control slipping. "Because it seems to me that you made assumptions about who was the aggressor and who was the victim based on who they are, not on what actually happened. And I want to know what Chase said to Marcus, what this history of tension was, because I suspect that if you actually investigated, you'd find that my son was responding to harassment, to racism, to being targeted. But you didn't investigate, did you? You just decided that the black kid was violent and needed to be removed." "That is not fair," Mr. Hayes said, his voice rising slightly. "We conducted a thorough review of the incident. We interviewed witnesses, we reviewed security footage, and we made a decision based on the evidence." Julian leaned forward. "You reviewed security footage? Then show it to me. Let me see what actually happened." There was another pause, longer this time, and Julian could see the discomfort spreading across their faces. Finally, Dr. Pemberton said, "The footage is part of the disciplinary record, and we're not able to share it with parents. But I can assure you that it corroborated the witness statements." "Not able to share it?" Julian repeated, the anger breaking through now. You're expelling my son based on footage you won't let me see, based on witness statements you won't let me examine, based on a process that seems designed to protect the school's liability rather than to determine what actually happened. That's not justice, Dr. Pemberton. That's a railroad. The room was silent, the tension thick, and Julian could see that he was not going to get anywhere with this approach, that the decision had been made and the administrators were dug in, committed to defending it. He took a breath, shifted tactics. I want to appeal this decision. What's the process for that? Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat. Parents have the right to appeal to the Board of Trustees. You would need to submit a written appeal within 5 business days, and the board would review it and make a determination. But I want to be clear that expulsions are rarely overturned. The board generally defers to the judgment of the administration and the disciplinary committee. I'll be filing an appeal, Julian said. And I'll be requesting access to all the evidence you claim to have, including the security footage, the witness statements, and any records of prior incidents between Marcus and Chase. If you're confident in your decision, then you should have no problem sharing that information. The administrators exchanged glances again, and Julian could see the calculation happening, the weighing of legal obligations against the desire to keep the process opaque, to maintain control. We'll consult with our legal counsel about what can be shared, Dr. Pemberton said finally. But Mr. Cross, I want to reiterate that the decision is final unless and until the board overturns it. Marcus is not permitted on campus, and if he attempts to attend classes or school events, he will be considered trespassing. Julian stood, pushed his chair back with more force than necessary. I'll be filing that appeal today. And Dr. Pemberton, you should know that I take this very seriously. My son has a right to due process, and if this school denied him that, there will be consequences. He walked out of the conference room without waiting for a response, his hands shaking with the effort of keeping his anger contained, and he made it to his car before pulling out his phone and calling his attorney. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in education law and civil rights, answered immediately. Patricia, I need your help. My son was just expelled from his school, and I think they violated his rights. I need to file an appeal, and I need to understand what our legal options are. Patricia listened as Julian recounted the meeting, asked clarifying questions, and then said, Okay, first we file the appeal, and we request all the evidence they have. Private schools have more leeway than public schools when it comes to discipline, but they still have to follow their own policies. And if they didn't give Marcus due process according to their handbook, we may have grounds to challenge the expulsion. Second, we need to investigate the incident ourselves. We need to talk to Marcus, find out what the history with this other student is, and see if there are witnesses who would be willing to come forward with a different version of events. And third, we need to be prepared for this to get ugly. If the school is digging in, they're going to fight, and this could become a very public battle. Julian thought about that, about what it would mean to make this public, to put his son's story and his own wealth and influence on display, to invite scrutiny and judgment and the inevitable accusations that he was trying to buy his way out of consequences. But he also thought about Marcus, about the fear in his son's voice on the phone, about the injustice of being expelled without a fair hearing, and he knew that he could not let this stand. Let's do it, Julian said. File the appeal, start the investigation, and let's be ready for whatever comes. Over the next several days, Julian and Patricia worked to build their case. They met with Marcus, who told them the full story, that Chase Langford had been harassing him for months, making racist comments, calling him slurs, pushing him in the hallways, and that the school had done nothing despite Marcus reporting the harassment multiple times. The incident that led to the expulsion, Marcus said, had happened after Chase had cornered him in the hallway, called him a racial slur, and shoved him. Marcus had shoved back, and then Chase had swung at him, and Marcus had punched Chase in the face, hard enough to break his nose. "I know I shouldn't have hit him," Marcus said, his voice thick with frustration and shame. "I know I should have walked away. But Dad, I was so tired. Tired of the comments, tired of being pushed around, tired of reporting it and nothing happening. And in that moment, I just snapped." Julian listened, feeling the weight of his son's pain, the exhaustion of navigating a space where you were constantly targeted, constantly on edge, constantly having to prove that you belonged. "We're going to fix this," Julian told Marcus. "We're going to make sure the school knows what really happened, and we're going to hold them accountable for not protecting you." Patricia interviewed several of Marcus's friends, students who confirmed that Chase had been harassing Marcus, that there had been racist comments and physical intimidation, and that Marcus had reported it to teachers and administrators multiple times without any action being taken. One student, a junior named Aiden Kim, said he had witnessed the incident in the hallway and that his account differed from what the school was claiming. "Chase started it," Aiden said in a recorded interview. "He was in Marcus's face, saying horrible things, and he pushed Marcus first. Marcus pushed back, and then Chase swung at him. Marcus punched him, yeah, but it was self-defense. And the school is acting like Marcus just attacked him out of nowhere, which is bullshit." Patricia compiled the evidence, including Marcus's reports of harassment, the witness statements from his friends, and a detailed timeline of events. And she drafted a comprehensive appeal that was submitted to the Board of Trustees. The appeal argued that Marcus had been denied due process, that the school had failed to investigate the harassment he had reported, and that the expulsion was disproportionate and unjust, given the circumstances. The board scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks later, and Julian spent those 2 weeks in a state of controlled fury, working during the day to keep his company running, spending evenings with Marcus helping him keep up with schoolwork, and trying to shield him from the worst of the stress, and lying awake at night thinking about what would happen if the appeal failed, if Marcus's expulsion stood, if his son carried this mark for the rest of his life. The hearing was held in the same conference room where Julian had met with the administrators, and this time the room was crowded. The Board of Trustees, 6 people in total, sitting on one side of the table, Dr. Pemberton, Mrs. Cartwright, and Mr. Hayes on the other, and Julian, Marcus, and Patricia on the third side. The board chair, a woman named Evelyn Sinclair, who was a retired judge and longtime Westwood parent, opened the hearing by explaining the process. The school would present its case, Julian and Patricia would present theirs, and then the board would deliberate and issue a decision. Dr. Pemberton went first, walking through the same narrative he had given Julian in the initial meeting. The fight, the injuries, the zero-tolerance policy, the need to maintain a safe environment. He showed the security footage, which was grainy and taken from a distance, and which showed Marcus and Chase in the hallway, a physical exchange, and Chase falling. What the footage did not show, because of the angle and the quality, was who had initiated the contact, what had been said, or the context of the interaction. Then Patricia presented their case. She walked through Marcus's reports of harassment, which she had obtained through a formal request to the school, and which showed a pattern of complaints dating back months, none of which had resulted in any disciplinary action against Chase. She played Aiden Kim's recorded statement, which contradicted the school's version of events. And she argued that the school had violated its own policies by not conducting a thorough investigation, by not interviewing all relevant witnesses, and by not considering the context of the incident when determining consequences. "Marcus Cross is not a violent student," Patricia said, her voice clear and forceful. "He has no history of disciplinary issues, no prior incidents of aggression. What he has is a history of being harassed, of being targeted, of reporting that harassment and being ignored. And when he finally defended himself, the school expelled him without due process, without a fair hearing, and without considering the role that the other student played in creating the situation. This is not justice. This is scapegoating, and it is a violation of the values that Westwood Preparatory claims to uphold. The board asked questions, probing the details, asking about the harassment reports, about the witness statements, about the school's investigation. And then Evelyn Sinclair, the board chair, turned to Dr. Pemberton and said, "Dr. Pemberton, why were these harassment reports not acted on? Why was there no disciplinary action taken against Chase Langford?" Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. "We take all reports seriously, but we have to balance the need to address concerns with the need to avoid overreacting to teenage conflicts. The reports Marcus filed were reviewed, but we determined that they did not rise to the level of requiring formal discipline." "And yet," Evelyn said, her tone skeptical, "the harassment escalated to the point where a physical altercation occurred, and one student ended up with a broken nose. It seems to me that perhaps the school should have intervened earlier." The hearing continued for another hour, and by the end, Julian felt cautiously hopeful that the board was seeing the flaws in the school's case, that they were questioning the process and the decision. But he also knew that boards often deferred to administrators, that overturning an expulsion was rare, and that there were no guarantees. The board deliberated for 30 minutes, and when they returned, Evelyn Sinclair delivered their decision. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing from both sides, the board has determined that Westwood Preparatory did not follow its own policies in this matter. The reports of harassment filed by Marcus Cross should have been investigated more thoroughly, and the decision to expel Marcus without considering the context of the incident was premature. Therefore, we are overturning the expulsion. Marcus will be reinstated, and we are directing the administration to conduct a full investigation into the harassment allegations and to take appropriate action if those allegations are substantiated." Julian felt the relief wash over him, felt Marcus's hand grip his arm, felt the validation of knowing that they had been right, that the fight had been worth it. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning, that Marcus would have to return to a school where he had been expelled, where the administrators who had pushed for his removal were still in charge, where Chase Langford and his friends were still there. Evelyn continued, "We also want to acknowledge the concerns raised by Mr. Cross and his attorney about the school's handling of harassment and discrimination. We will be forming a committee to review our policies and practices, and we will be working with an outside consultant to assess the school's culture and climate. This is not just about one incident. This is about ensuring that all students feel safe and supported at Westwood Preparatory." The hearing ended, and as Julian and Marcus and Patricia stood to leave, Dr. Pemberton approached, his expression tight and uncomfortable. "Mr. Cross, I want to apologize for the way this was handled. The board's decision is final, and we will, of course, comply with it. But I hope you understand that we were acting in what we believed was the best interest of the school community." Julian looked at him, felt the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "Dr. Pemberton, the best interest of the school community includes protecting students from harassment, investigating complaints, and applying discipline fairly. Your administration failed to do any of those things. I hope the review process the board mentioned will lead to real changes, because if it doesn't, I can promise you that this won't be the last time you hear from me." He walked out with Marcus and Patricia, and as they reached the parking lot, Marcus said quietly, "Thank you, Dad, for fighting for me. I was so scared that no one would believe me." Julian pulled his son into a hug, felt the emotion rise in his throat. "I will always fight for you, Marcus, always. And I'm sorry you had to go through this. If you have been following this story, if you have seen how Julian Cross used his resources and his determination to challenge an unjust decision, if you understand the weight that black parents carry when advocating for their children in spaces that do not see or value them, then you know that this fight was about more than one expulsion. It was about the systems that allow harassment to go unchecked, that punish victims for defending themselves, that prioritize reputation over justice. And if this resonates with you, if you see yourself or your community in this story, then consider sharing it, letting it be part of the larger conversation about accountability and fairness in institutions that claim to serve all children. The victory at the hearing felt significant, but as the days passed and Marcus prepared to return to Westwood Prep, Julian began to understand that overturning the expulsion was only the first battle in a longer war. The school had been forced to reinstate Marcus, but the administrators who had pushed for his removal were still in charge. The students who had witnessed or been part of the harassment were still there, and the culture that had allowed the harassment to happen in the first place had not changed. Marcus returned to school the following Monday, and the first day was brutal. Students stared, whispered, some openly hostile, some merely curious. Chase Langford, who had been suspended for a week pending the investigation into the harassment allegations, was not on campus, but his friends were, and they made their displeasure known. One boy, a senior named Tyler Richmond, cornered Marcus in the bathroom and said, "You think you're special because your dad has money? You got Chase suspended, you got the whole school in trouble, and for what? Because you can't take a joke?" Marcus did not respond, did not engage, just walked out of the bathroom and went to his next class. But the incident rattled him, and when Julian picked him up that afternoon, Marcus was quiet, withdrawn. And when they got home, he said, "I don't know if I can do this, Dad. I don't know if I can go back there every day and deal with this." Julian felt the helplessness, the anger, the desire to protect his son from a situation he could not fully control. "We don't have to stay there," he said. "If you want to transfer, if you want to find a different school, we can do that. I don't want you to suffer just because I insisted on fighting this." Marcus shook his head. "No, I want to stay. I want them to see that they can't just push me out. But Dad, it's hard. It's really hard." Julian reached out, put a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the school follows through on what the board said, that they actually investigate and make changes. But Marcus, if it becomes too much, if you feel like it's affecting your mental health or your safety, we leave. Your well-being is more important than proving a point." Marcus nodded, and they sat together in silence for a while, and Julian thought about the position they were in, the choice between staying and fighting for change, or leaving and finding a space where Marcus could just be a student, where he did not have to carry the weight of being the test case, the symbol, the one whose experience would determine whether the school was serious about reform. Over the next several weeks, the investigation into the harassment allegations moved forward, led by an outside consultant that the board had hired. The consultant, a woman named Dr. Angela Reeves, who specialized in school climate and equity, interviewed students, reviewed records, and observed the school environment. Her findings, delivered to the board in early December, were damning. The report documented a pattern of racist harassment targeting Marcus and other students of color, a culture of tolerance for that harassment among certain peer groups, and a failure by the administration to respond effectively to reports of bias and discrimination. The report recommended a series of reforms: mandatory anti-bias training for all students and staff, the creation of a student-led diversity council, the implementation of a clear reporting and response protocol for incidents of harassment, and the hiring of a dean of equity and inclusion to oversee these efforts. It also recommended that Chase Langford face significant disciplinary consequences, up to and including expulsion, given the severity and persistence of his behavior. The board accepted the report and its recommendations, and in mid-December, the school announced that Chase Langford had been expelled. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some families applauded the decision, saw it as evidence that the school was serious about change. Others were outraged, accused the school of caving to pressure, of punishing Chase for being the victim of Marcus's violence. The debate played out in parent WhatsApp groups and at holiday parties and intense conversations at school events. Julian watched the response with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Chase's expulsion felt like justice, like an acknowledgement that actions had consequences, but it also intensified the scrutiny on Marcus, the sense that he and his family were the reason the school was in turmoil. And Julian knew that the real test would be whether the school followed through on the other recommendations, whether the culture actually shifted, or whether this was just a performative gesture to appease the board and the families who were demanding accountability. In January, the school hired Dr. Michael Carter as the new Dean of Equity and Inclusion, and Dr. Carter began the work of implementing the report's recommendations. He met with Julian and Marcus, listened to their experiences, and committed to making Westwood a place where all students felt safe and valued. He launched the Diversity Council, which included Marcus and several other students of color, and he began conducting the mandatory training sessions, which were met with varying degrees of receptiveness depending on the audience. Julian attended one of the parent training sessions held on a weeknight in the school auditorium and watched as Dr. Carter presented data on implicit bias, on the ways that racism manifested in schools, on the impact of microaggressions and systemic exclusion. Some parents listened attentively, nodded, asked thoughtful questions. Others sat with arms crossed, expressions skeptical, and when the Q&A opened up, several voiced objections. One father, a man Julian recognized as a prominent entertainment attorney, stood and said, "I appreciate the work you're doing, Dr. Carter, but I'm concerned that we're focusing so much on race that we're losing sight of the academic excellence that makes Westwood special. My son came here to get into a top college, not to be indoctrinated into a particular political ideology." Dr. Carter responded calmly, professionally, but Julian could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weariness of having to defend basic concepts of equity and inclusion to people who were more concerned about their children's college prospects than about the safety and well-being of students of color. And Julian felt the same weariness, the same frustration, the same sense that change was going to be slow and incomplete and resisted at every turn. After the session, Julian approached Dr. Carter, introduced himself, and they spoke for a few minutes about Marcus and the progress being made. "I want you to know that I support this work," Julian said, "and if there's anything I can do to help, any resources you need, I'm here." Dr. Carter smiled, genuine and grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Cross. That means a lot. And actually, there is something. The work we're doing requires funding for training, for resources, for programs. The school has committed some money, but it's not enough to do everything we need to do. If you're serious about wanting to help, a financial contribution could make a real difference." Julian nodded. "Let me think about what makes sense. I want to support this work, but I also want to make sure the contribution is used effectively, that it's not just a donation that gets absorbed into the general budget without making a real impact." They exchanged contact information, and over the next few weeks, Julian and Dr. Carter met several times to discuss what a significant donation could fund. They talked about expanding the Diversity Council, creating scholarship programs for students of color, bringing in outside speakers and consultants, and developing a comprehensive curriculum on race and equity. Julian was impressed by Dr. Carter's vision, by his commitment to systemic change rather than just surface-level initiatives, and he decided to make a substantial commitment. In February, Julian met with the head of development at Westwood Prep, a woman named Susan Hargrove, and he made an offer, a $10 million donation, to be paid over 5 years, earmarked specifically for equity and inclusion initiatives overseen by Dr. Carter. The donation would be structured as a challenge grant, contingent on the school meeting certain benchmarks related to recruitment and retention of students and faculty of color, climate survey results, and the implementation of the recommended reforms. Susan was thrilled. effusive in her gratitude, and she immediately began the process of formalizing the gift, working with Julian's attorneys and the school's legal team to draft a gift agreement that outlined the terms and the accountability mechanisms. The gift was announced internally in March, shared with the board and the administration, and Julian received calls and emails from board members and other major donors, some congratulating him, some expressing curiosity about what had motivated such a large commitment. But the announcement was kept relatively quiet, not publicized broadly to the parent community or to the press, because Julian did not want the donation to be seen as an attempt to buy influence or to shield his son from future scrutiny. He wanted the gift to speak for itself, to fund real work, to be part of the solution rather than a distraction or a controversy. What Julian did not anticipate was that the donation would become public in a very different way, and that it would shift the dynamics at the school in ways he had not expected. In late March, Marcus came home from school upset, saying that a teacher, Mrs. Helen Foster, who taught AP European history, had made a comment in class that had bothered him. According to Marcus, the class had been discussing colonialism and its legacy, and Mrs. Foster had said something to the effect of, "We can't keep blaming everything on the past. At some point, people need to take responsibility for their own lives rather than blaming systemic racism for every problem." The comment had sparked a debate in the class, with Marcus and a few other students pushing back, and Mrs. Foster had become defensive, doubling down on her position. Marcus had left the class feeling dismissed and frustrated, and he reported the incident to Dr. Carter, who said he would follow up with Mrs. Foster. The next day, Dr. Carter met with Mrs. Foster, and the conversation, according to what Dr. Carter later told Julian, did not go well. Mrs. Foster denied that her comment was inappropriate, said that she was teaching students to think critically and not to accept narratives uncritically, and suggested that Marcus was being oversensitive. Dr. Carter explained that the comment was harmful, that it dismissed the realities of systemic racism, and that it created an unwelcoming environment for students of color. Mrs. Foster responded that she had been teaching at Westwood for 20 years, that she had never been accused of bias before, and that she resented being told how to teach by someone who had only been at the school for a few months. The conflict escalated, and Mrs. Foster filed a complaint with the administration, arguing that Dr. Carter was overstepping his role, that he was trying to censor her curriculum, and that he was creating a hostile work environment. Dr. Pemberton, the principal, was in a difficult position. He had been directed by the board to support Dr. Carter's work, but he also had a teacher with seniority and a strong record who was claiming that her academic freedom was being violated. Dr. Pemberton called Julian, asked if they could meet to discuss the situation, and Julian agreed, though he was wary about what the meeting would involve. They met in Dr. Pemberton's office, and Dr. Pemberton explained the situation, framed it as a conflict that needed to be managed carefully, and suggested that perhaps Dr. Carter had been too aggressive in his approach. Julian listened, felt the anger rising again, the familiar pattern of the school trying to avoid conflict, trying to placate the person with power and seniority rather than supporting the work they had committed to doing. "Dr. Pemberton," Julian said, voice tight, "you hired Dr. Carter to do a job, to address the culture and climate issues at this school. He's doing that job. And now, when he challenges a teacher who made a comment that was dismissive and harmful, you're suggesting that he's the problem. That's not acceptable." Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not saying he's the problem. I'm saying that we need to find a way to address these issues that doesn't create division among the faculty. Mrs. Foster is a valued member of our community, and we need to handle this delicately. And Marcus is a valued member of your community," Julian said. "And he's the one who was harmed by Mrs. Foster's comment. So where's the concern for his well-being? Where's the commitment to making sure he's not subjected to this kind of dismissal in the classroom?" Dr. Pemberton did not have a good answer. And the meeting ended with Julian making it clear that he expected the school to support Dr. Carter, to address Mrs. Foster's behavior, and to prioritize the students' experiences over the comfort of the faculty. But as he left the meeting, Julian felt the weight of knowing that this was going to be a constant battle, that every step forward would be met with resistance, that the school was more interested in managing perceptions than in making real change. He called Dr. Carter after the meeting, told him what had been said, and Dr. Carter sighed. "This is what I was afraid of. The administration wants the work to happen, but they don't want it to be uncomfortable, and they don't want to hold people accountable. Mr. Cross, I'm committed to this, but I need you to know that I can't do it alone. I need the board and the administration to back me up, even when it's hard." "I'll talk to the board," Julian said, "and I'll make sure they understand that this is part of the work, that addressing bias in the faculty is just as important as addressing it among students." Over the next several weeks, Julian had conversations with several board members, making the case that the school needed to support Dr. Carter, that the resistance from some faculty was predictable but needed to be managed, that the commitment to equity and inclusion had to be more than words. Some board members were receptive, agreed that the school needed to stay the course. Others were more hesitant, worried about faculty morale, about potential legal challenges, about the optics of disciplining a long-time teacher. And then, in early April, the situation came to a head. Mrs. Foster, frustrated by what she saw as the administration's failure to support her, reached out to several other parents, including some who were already skeptical of the equity work, and she shared her version of events, that she was being silenced, that Dr. Carter was pushing a political agenda, that the school was sacrificing academic freedom in the name of appeasing a vocal minority. The story spread, fueled by parent WhatsApp groups and social media, and within days there was a faction of parents demanding that the board investigate Dr. Carter, that they reconsider the equity initiatives, that they restore what they called balance to the school's approach. Julian heard about the growing controversy from Dr. Carter, who was increasingly concerned that the board might buckle under pressure, that the progress they had made might be rolled back. And Julian made a decision. It was time to make the donation public, to make it clear that he was all in on this work, that he was not going to allow the school to backtrack. He called Susan Hargrove, the head of development, and told her that he wanted the donation announced, that he wanted it to be public knowledge that he had committed $10 million to equity and inclusion initiatives. Susan was surprised, asked if he was sure, warned him that making the donation public could invite scrutiny and controversy. But Julian was firm. "I want people to know that this work matters to me, that I'm investing in it, and that I expect the school to follow through on its commitments. Make the announcement." Susan agreed, and within days, the donation was announced via email to the full parent community, with a press release sent to local media. The announcement described Julian's commitment, the structure of the challenge grant, and the goals of the equity and inclusion initiatives. It positioned the donation as a vote of confidence in the school's direction, as a signal that Westwood Prep was serious about becoming a leader in equitable education. The response was immediate and intense. Some parents applauded the donation, saw it as a generous and necessary investment. Others were critical, questioned why so much money was being directed to equity initiatives rather than to academics or facilities, suggested that Julian was trying to buy influence or to push a political agenda. And a few, including some of Mrs. Foster's allies, connected the dots. Julian was the father of the student whose expulsion had been overturned, whose case had sparked the equity review, whose experience had led to Chase Langford's expulsion. The donation, they argued, was not altruistic. It was an attempt to shape the school in his image, to silence dissent, to ensure that his son was protected from future consequences. The accusations stung, and Julian found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his motivations questioned, his generosity turned into evidence of self-interest. But he also saw that the donation had shifted the dynamics, had made it harder for the board to ignore the equity work, had given Dr. Carter and his allies leverage in the ongoing debates about the school's direction. One evening, Julian received a call from Evelyn Sinclair, the board chair, who said she wanted to meet with him to discuss the donation and the situation at the school. They met for coffee, and Evelyn was direct. "Julian, I want to thank you for the donation. It's extraordinary, and it's going to make a real difference. But I also want to be honest with you about the position this puts the board in. There are parents who are unhappy, who feel like the school is changing in ways they didn't sign up for, and some of them are pointing to your donation as evidence that the board is being influenced by outside pressure. I need to know that you understand the complexity here, that you're prepared for the scrutiny." Julian met her gaze, voice steady. "Evelyn, I'm not trying to buy influence. I'm trying to support work that I believe in, work that will make the school better for all students, including my son. If people want to question my motivations, that's their right. But I'm not going to apologize for using my resources to push for change." Evelyn nodded. "I respect that, and I want you to know that the board is committed to the equity work. But we're also navigating a community that is divided, and we have to be strategic about how we move forward. The investigation into Mrs. Foster is ongoing, and we're going to need to make some difficult decisions. I wanted to give you a heads up that this is going to get messier before it gets better." "I understand," Julian said, "and I'm ready for it." The investigation into Mrs. Foster concluded in late April, and the findings were shared with the board and the administration. The investigation determined that Mrs. Foster's comments in class had been inappropriate, that they had created a hostile environment for students of color, and that her response to Dr. Carter's feedback had been defensive and dismissive. The recommendation was that Mrs. Foster be required to undergo training on culturally responsive teaching, that she be formally reprimanded, and that she be placed on a professional improvement plan. Dr. Pemberton shared the findings with Mrs. Foster, and she resigned immediately, issuing a statement that she could no longer work in an environment where her academic freedom was not respected, where she was being punished for encouraging critical thinking. Her resignation was covered by local media, framed as a controversy about free speech and political correctness in private schools, and it sparked yet another wave of debate among the parent community. Some parents were relieved, felt that Mrs. Foster's departure was necessary and long overdue. Others were angry, felt that the school had caved to pressure, that a good teacher had been driven out by an overreaction to a comment taken out of context. The debate was polarizing, divisive, and it highlighted the deep fault lines within the Westwood community about what kind of school it wanted to be. Julian watched the fallout with a mixture of frustration and resolve. He knew that Mrs. Foster's resignation would be blamed on him, on his donation, on his advocacy for his son. But he also knew that the school had made a choice, had decided that equity and inclusion mattered more than the comfort of faculty who refused to engage with those values. And that choice, difficult and controversial as it was, represented progress. If you have been following Julian and Marcus through this journey, if you have seen how a single incident of injustice sparked a larger reckoning, if you understand the complexity of navigating institutions that claim to value diversity but resist the work of actually becoming equitable, then you know that this story is about more than one family or one school. It is about the ways that wealth and privilege can be used to demand accountability, about the coalitions that form when people refuse to accept the status quo, about the cost and the value of fighting for change. And if this resonates with you, if it reminds you of your own experiences or the experiences of people you care about, then share it, talk about it, let it be part of the larger conversation about justice and education and the kind of institutions we want to build. The spring semester continued, and the school moved forward with the equity initiatives, though the atmosphere remained tense. Dr. Carter implemented the Diversity Council, launched the speaker series, and worked with faculty on curriculum revisions. Marcus continued to attend classes, to participate in the council, to navigate the complicated dynamics of being both a student and a symbol. And Julian remained involved, attending board meetings, checking in with Dr. Carter, ensuring that the school was meeting the benchmarks outlined in the Challenge Grant Agreement. In May, the school held its annual auction, a major fundraising event that typically brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars from parent donations and sponsorships. Julian had always attended in the past, had bid on items, had contributed to the school's annual fund, but this year he considered skipping it, not wanting to subject himself or his family to the scrutiny and the judgment of parents who saw him as the source of the school's problems. But Marcus asked him to attend, said that he wanted to show that they were not going to be driven out, that they were part of the community despite the controversy. So Julian agreed, and on the night of the auction, he and Marcus and his wife Camille, who had been supportive throughout the ordeal but had mostly stayed out of the public-facing aspects of the fight, dressed up and drove to the Westwood campus, where the event was being held in the newly renovated Performing Arts Center that Julian's foundation had helped fund several years earlier. The irony was not lost on him. He walked into a building that bore a plaque thanking donors, including the Cross Family Foundation, and he was greeted with a mix of warm smiles from some parents and cool, distant nods from others. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers, the way conversations paused as he passed. And he knew that his presence was making people uncomfortable, that he had become a polarizing figure in a community that valued consensus and politeness above all else. The auction proceeded with the usual mix of live and silent auction items, vacation packages, art, experiences, gift certificates. And then, toward the end of the evening, Dr. Pemberton took the stage to make the traditional pitch for the annual fund, asking parents to consider making or increasing their contributions to support the school's operating budget and its programs. Dr. Pemberton spoke about the school's achievements, about the strength of its community, about the importance of supporting the mission. And then, to Julian's surprise, he said, "I also want to take a moment to acknowledge an extraordinary gift that was announced recently. Julian Cross, one of our parents, has committed $10 million to our equity and inclusion initiatives. This gift represents a transformational investment in our school's future, and it reflects Julian's commitment to making Westwood a place where all students can thrive. Julian, would you stand so we can recognize you?" Julian was caught off guard, had not expected this public acknowledgement, but he stood, and the room erupted in applause. It was not unanimous. There were pockets of people who did not clap, who sat with arms crossed or expressions tight, but it was substantial, and it felt, in that moment, like a turning point, like an acknowledgement that the work mattered, that the donation was seen as a positive contribution rather than a controversial intrusion. After the event, several parents approached Julian to thank him, to express support, to share their own stories of why the equity work was important to them. One mother, a white woman whose daughter was in Marcus's grade, said, "I just want you to know that I'm so grateful for what you've done. My daughter has learned so much this year about privilege and racism and how to be a better ally, and it's made her a more thoughtful, compassionate person. Thank you for pushing the school to do this work." Julian thanked her, felt the validation, the sense that there were allies, that the community was not as divided as it sometimes felt. And later, as they drove home, Marcus said quietly, "That was good, Dad. Seeing people clap for you, seeing them recognize what you've done. It made me feel like maybe we're not as alone as I thought." Julian reached over, squeezed his son's shoulder. "We're not alone, Marcus. There are a lot of people who want the school to be better, who are willing to do the work. And we're part of that. We're helping to make it happen. The school year ended, and the summer provided a respite from the intensity of the fights and the controversies. Julian and his family traveled, spent time at their house in Montecito, and Marcus focused on preparing for his senior year and on college applications. Julian used the time to reflect on what they had been through, on the cost of the fight and the progress that had been made, on whether it had been worth it. He thought about the expulsion, about the fear and the anger he had felt, about the determination to prove that his son had been wronged. He thought about the appeal, about the board's decision to reinstate Marcus, about the investigation that had led to Chase Langford's expulsion. He thought about the donation, about the equity initiatives, about the resistance and the slow, uneven progress. And he thought about Marcus, about the resilience his son had shown, about the person he was becoming, shaped by the experience but not broken by it. In August, before the start of the new school year, Julian received a call from Evelyn Sinclair, the board chair, asking if he would be willing to join the board of trustees. It was an unexpected invitation, and Julian's first instinct was to decline, to say that he had done enough, that he wanted to step back from the intensity of being so directly involved in the school's governance. But Evelyn pressed, argued that his perspective was needed, that the board would benefit from having someone who understood the equity work deeply and personally, who could hold the administration accountable and ensure that the commitments were sustained. Julian talked it over with Camille and with Marcus, and they encouraged him to accept, to use the platform to continue the work, to be a voice for change at the highest level of the school's leadership. So he agreed, and in September, as Marcus started his senior year, Julian joined the Board of Trustees, one of the first black members in the school's history. The first board meeting was in October, and Julian walked into the room with a mix of anticipation and wariness, aware that he was entering a space that had historically been dominated by wealthy white families, that his presence was a shift in the dynamics, that some board members might resent or resist his influence. But Evelyn welcomed him warmly, and the other board members, to varying degrees, seemed open to his participation. The meeting covered the usual business: budget, enrollment, facilities, development. But it also included an update from Dr. Carter on the equity initiatives, and Julian listened as Dr. Carter presented data on the progress. The Diversity Council was thriving. The climate surveys showed improvement. The recruitment efforts had resulted in a more diverse incoming class. The faculty training was ongoing. The data was encouraging. But Dr. Carter also noted challenges: ongoing resistance from some faculty and parents, the difficulty of sustaining momentum, the need for continued investment and support. After Dr. Carter's presentation, one of the board members, a man named Gregory Donovan, who was a hedge fund manager and longtime Westwood parent, spoke up. "I appreciate the work that's being done, but I'm concerned about the cost. We're spending a significant amount on these initiatives, and I'm not sure we're seeing a return on investment that justifies the expense. At some point, we need to ask whether we're prioritizing equity at the expense of other things that matter, like academic excellence or facilities." Julian felt the anger rise, felt the familiar frustration of hearing people frame equity as optional, as something that competed with excellence rather than being foundational to it. He raised his hand, and Evelyn called on him. "Gregory, with respect, I think you're framing this wrong," Julian said, voice calm but firm. "Equity is not in competition with academic excellence. It's a prerequisite for it. Students can't excel if they don't feel safe, if they're being harassed, if they're being taught by faculty who dismiss or demean them. The work Dr. Carter is doing is making the school better for all students, not just students of color. And as for the cost, I'd argue that the cost of not doing this work is much higher. The cost is students leaving, families withdrawing, a reputation as a school that talks about values but doesn't live them. So yes, it's expensive, but it's necessary, and it's worth it." There was silence in the room, and Julian could see the board members processing his words, some nodding, some looking uncomfortable. Gregory did not respond, but Evelyn said, "Thank you, Julian. I think that's an important perspective, and I hope we can all agree that the equity work is central to our mission, not peripheral to it." The meeting moved on, but Julian felt that he had established something, that he had made it clear that he was not going to be a passive board member, that he was going to use his voice and his platform to push for the values he believed in. Over the next several months, Julian became more deeply involved in the board's work, serving on the equity committee, working with Dr. Carter on strategy, and pushing for continued investment in the initiatives. He also used his position to build relationships with other board members, to find allies, to create a coalition of people who were committed to the long-term work of transformation. In February, the board held a retreat to discuss the school's strategic plan for the next 5 years, and Julian came prepared with a proposal that Westwood commit to becoming a model for equity in independent schools, that the school set ambitious targets for diversity in enrollment and staffing, that it invest in research and partnerships that would position it as a leader in the field. The proposal was ambitious, and it met with mixed reactions, but by the end of the retreat, the board had agreed to incorporate many of Julian's ideas into the strategic plan, to make equity a central pillar of the school's vision for the future. Marcus graduated from Westwood Prep in the spring of 2026, and at his graduation, he was awarded the school's highest honor, the Founders Award, given to the student who best exemplified the school's values of integrity, leadership, and service. In his speech, Marcus talked about his experience at Westwood, about the challenges he had faced, about the people who had supported him, and about the importance of speaking up when you see injustice. "I came to this school as a freshman, excited to learn, to grow, to be part of a community," Marcus said, standing at the podium in his cap and gown. "And I did learn, and I did grow, but not always in the ways I expected. I learned what it feels like to be targeted, to be harassed, to be expelled for defending myself. I learned what it feels like to have people doubt my worth, my character, my right to be here. But I also learned what it feels like to fight back, to have people stand with you, to see an institution change because people refuse to accept the status quo. And I learned that from my dad, who never gave up on me, who never let the school forget that I deserved justice. So thank you, Dad, for showing me what courage looks like, and thank you, Westwood, for becoming the school I always hoped you could be." Julian sat in the audience, tears streaming down his face, feeling the pride and the relief and the sense that they had come through something difficult and had emerged on the other side, stronger, more aware, more committed to the work of justice. Marcus's speech was met with a standing ovation, and afterward dozens of people approached Julian to congratulate him, to thank him, to express their admiration for what he and Marcus had accomplished. And as Julian stood there, surrounded by people, holding the program that listed his son's name and his accomplishments, he thought about the journey they had been on, from the phone call that had shattered a normal Tuesday afternoon to this moment of celebration and recognition. It had been hard, exhausting, often thankless, but it had also been worth it because Marcus had gotten the justice he deserved, because the school had been forced to confront its failings and to change, because other students would benefit from the work that had been done. 2 years after Marcus's graduation, Julian was still serving on the board, still working with Dr. Carter, still pushing for continued progress. The school had met many of the benchmarks outlined in the Challenge Grant, and Julian had made good on his commitment, transferring the full $10 million over the course of the 5 years. The initiatives funded by the donation had expanded. The Diversity Council now included middle school students. The curriculum had been revised to center diverse voices and perspectives. The faculty was more diverse and better trained, and the climate surveys showed sustained improvement in sense of belonging and satisfaction among students and families of color. But the work was not finished. There were still challenges, still incidents, still pockets of resistance. And Julian remained vigilant, knowing that institutions did not change themselves, that they required constant pressure and accountability, that the moment you let up, the moment you assumed the work was done, was the moment things began to slide back. One afternoon, Julian was in his office when he received a call from a parent at Westwood, a black father named Anthony Mitchell, whose son was in 9th grade. Anthony said he was calling because his son had been having a difficult time at the school, had been experiencing microaggressions and isolation, and he did not know what to do. Julian listened, heard the frustration and the fear in Anthony's voice, and he said, "I've been there. I know what you're going through, and I want you to know that you're not alone, that there are people at the school who will support you, and that it's worth fighting for your son." They talked for an hour, and Julian shared his experience, offered advice, connected Anthony with Dr. Carter and with other parents who could provide support. And when they hung up, Julian felt the weight of that, the responsibility of having his story become a roadmap for others. The knowledge that the work he had done was not just for Marcus, but for all the black families who would come after, who would need to know that they could demand better, that they could fight and win, that they did not have to accept injustice. 3 years after Marcus's graduation, Westwood Prep held a celebration to mark the completion of the Equity and Inclusion Strategic Plan and to launch the next phase of the work. The event was held on campus, and it featured speeches from Dr. Carter, from Evelyn Sinclair, and from several students who had been part of the Diversity Council. Julian was asked to speak, and he stood at the podium in the same auditorium where he had watched Marcus perform in school plays and graduate, and he told the story one more time, the story of the phone call and the expulsion and the fight. "I came to this school as a parent who believed in education, who believed in excellence, who believed that if I gave my son access to the best resources, he would thrive," Julian said. "And I learned that access is not enough, that excellence requires equity, that a school can have all the resources in the world and still fail the students who need it most. But I also learned that change is possible, that institutions can transform, that people can come together and demand better. And I learned that from Marcus, from the other families who stood with us, from Dr. Carter and the board members who were willing to take risks, from the students who spoke up and demanded that their experiences be heard. So I want to thank all of you for doing the work, for staying committed, for making Westwood a place where all students can belong. And I want to challenge you to keep going, to keep pushing, because the work is never done, but it is always worth it." The audience erupted in applause, and Julian stepped off the stage, feeling the fullness of the moment, the sense of having contributed to something lasting, something that would outlive him, something that would shape the experiences of students he would never meet, but who would benefit from the foundation that had been built. And if you have stayed with this story, if you have walked with Julian and Marcus from the moment of crisis to this moment of celebration, if you have seen how a single unjust decision became the catalyst for transformation, then you know that this is not just about one school or one family. It is about the power of refusing to accept injustice, about the resources and the courage it takes to fight, about the coalitions that form when people decide that the status quo is unacceptable. Carry this story with you. Share it with others. Let it be part of your own commitment to building institutions that live up to their stated values, that see and value all people, that make justice and equity as central to their mission as academic excellence. The years continued to unfold, and Julian remained connected to Westwood, though his role evolved. He stepped down from the board after 6 years, feeling that he had done the work he had set out to do, that it was time for new voices and new leadership. But he stayed involved in education advocacy, serving on the boards of organizations working on equity in independent schools, funding scholarships for students of color, and mentoring other parents who were navigating similar challenges at their children's schools. Marcus went to college, then to graduate school, studying education policy with a focus on racial justice. He wrote his dissertation on discipline disparities in private schools, using his own experience as a case study, and the dissertation was published as a book that became required reading in teacher training programs. He credited his father in the acknowledgments for showing him what it meant to fight for what was right, for refusing to accept injustice, for using privilege and resources to demand accountability. And Julian, now in his 50s, looked back on the journey with a sense of satisfaction and humility. The expulsion and the fight that followed had been one of the most difficult periods of his life, a time when he had been forced to confront the limits of his wealth and influence, the ways that racism persisted even in spaces that claimed to be progressive and inclusive. But it had also been a time of growth, of learning, of building relationships and coalitions that had lasting impact. He thought often about the phone call, about the moment when Dr. Pemberton had said that Marcus was expelled, about the shock and the anger and the determination that had followed. And he thought about the decision he had made to fight rather than to accept, to use every resource at his disposal to ensure that his son got justice. It had not been easy, and it had not been without cost, but it had been right. One evening, years after the incident, Julian and Marcus were having dinner together, just the two of them, and Marcus said, "Dad, I've been thinking about that time when I got expelled, about how you fought for me, about how you used the donation to push the school to change. Do you ever regret it? Making it so public? Putting yourself out there?" Julian thought about it, about the scrutiny and the criticism, about the parents who had accused him of buying influence, about the stress and the conflict. But he also thought about the changes that had been made, about the students who had benefited, about the way Westwood had become a different place, a better place. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. I wish it hadn't been necessary. I wish the school had done the right thing from the beginning. But I'm proud of what we accomplished, and I'm proud of you for having the courage to keep going, to not let them break you." Marcus smiled, reached across the table to squeeze his father's hand. "I couldn't have done it without you." "We did it together," Julian said, "and that's what matters." They finished their dinner, and as they walked out into the evening, Julian thought about the legacy they had built, about the story that would be told, about the way their fight had become part of a larger movement for justice in education. And he felt at peace, knowing that he had done what he could, that he had used his wealth and his voice and his platform to make the world a little bit more just, a little bit more equitable, a little bit better for the children who came after. The story of Julian Cross and Marcus Cross did not end with a neat resolution or a triumphant victory. It ended, as all real stories do, in the middle of things, with work still to be done, systems still to be challenged, institutions still to be transformed. But it ended with a father and a son who had refused to be broken, who had fought for justice and won, who had used their experience to create change that would last far beyond their own lives. And that, in the end, was enough.